began, as so many horrors do, in secrecy. In the frozen plains of Manchuria, where the wind cut like steel and silence hid the sins of men, a facility was built that would never officially exist. On maps, it was a research center. In reality, it was hell disguised as science. The year was 1936, and Japan's empire, hungry for power and expansion, was preparing to wage not only war for territory, but for knowledge. Not the kind that enlightens, but the kind that destroys. This was the birth of Unit 731. The world knew Japan as a nation of warriors, artists, and inventors. But behind the curtain of discipline and progress, a darker ambition grew. The Imperial Japanese Army wanted a weapon unlike any other, one that could kill silently, invisibly, and in numbers too vast to imagine. While Europe experimented with gas and machinery, Japan turned to biology, disease, bacteria, and the manipulation of life itself. To them, microbes could become bombs. Death could be cultivated, studied, and deployed like artillery. At the center of this nightmare stood one man, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. Charismatic, brilliant, and utterly ruthless, Ishii was not a madman in the traditional sense. He saw himself as a visionary. He believed biological warfare was the future, that it could cripple enemies without wasting bullets or bombs. He promised his superiors results that would bring Japan dominance, and they gave him everything: funding, authority, and a blank check for human experimentation. His laboratory became a kingdom, his subjects unwilling citizens, prisoners, and innocents. In the city of Pingfong, near Harbin in occupied Manchuria, a vast complex rose behind guarded fences and coded signs. To outsiders, it was a water purification plant. To insiders, it was a slaughterhouse of science. There were barracks, operating theaters, crematoriums, and laboratories. A train line delivered logs, a cruel nickname for human beings. Once they arrived, they never left alive. The experiments defied imagination. Prisoners, Chinese civilians, Korean captives, Russian prisoners of war, and even a few Westerners were infected with plague, anthrax, cholera, and typhus. Their bodies were studied as they died. No anesthesia, no mercy. Limbs were frozen and amputated to study frostbite. Organs were removed while victims were still breathing to see disease progression in real time. Pressure chambers crushed lungs until they burst. Some were burned, others shot, all in the name of science and empire. Inside those walls, compassion died first. Doctors, many of them university educated, performed unspeakable acts with calm professionalism. They justified it as duty, as research, as sacrifice for the emperor. In their minds, Japan's superiority made the lives of others expendable. And so death became routine. Notes were taken, charts were filled, results were cataloged neatly, as if each scream had been reduced to data. Outside the facility, life went on. Farmers worked the land, soldiers guarded gates. Few knew what truly happened within. Fewer dared to question it. Unit 731 expanded, establishing satellite labs across China, each one a node in a growing web of biological warfare development. They tested plague bombs dropped from planes. Fleas carrying bacteria were released into villages. Wells were poisoned. The goal, to perfect the art of mass infection. By the time World War II reached its height, Ishii's men had developed weapons capable of unleashing pandemics. They tested them not only in secret labs, but on entire populations. Chinese towns became test fields. Thousands died in outbreaks engineered by human hands. The war crimes were beyond comprehension, but they were committed with bureaucratic efficiency. As Japan's empire began to crumble in 1945, Ishii faced his greatest fear, not defeat, but discovery. He knew the Americans were coming, and that if the truth emerged,
he and his entire unit would face execution for crimes against humanity. So he gave the order: destroy everything. Laboratories burned, documents shredded, prisoners executed. The ghosts of Manchuria were buried under ash and secrecy. But not all could be erased. Some scientists escaped. Some data survived. And Ishii himself, the man behind the nightmare, vanished into the fog of surrender. When U.S. occupation forces arrived in Japan, they began uncovering rumors of something monstrous. Testimonies surfaced. Locals whispered of the plague factory. Chinese survivors recounted stories of infection and torture. U.S. intelligence officers, already aware of Nazi medical crimes in Europe, suspected Japan had done the same, or worse. But what they discovered shocked even the most hardened investigators. Unit 731's experiments weren't just barbaric, they were scientifically advanced. The data collected through unimaginable cruelty offered unique insights into biological warfare and human endurance. It was, from a military standpoint, invaluable. And in the emerging shadow of the Cold War, information was power. The U.S. was no longer just fighting Japan or Germany, now it faced the Soviet Union. And both sides sought dominance not only in weapons, but in science. So a dark calculation began. What was justice worth compared to strategic advantage? If executing Ishii and his team meant losing access to biological data that could save American lives in a future war, was it worth it? The decision fell not to moral philosophers, but to military strategists, and they chose pragmatism over principle. By 1947, an agreement was reached in secret. The United States offered full immunity to Ishii and his scientists in exchange for their research. They would not stand trial at Tokyo. They would not face prison or death. Instead, they would hand over their findings, every chart, every note, every experiment. In return, their crimes would vanish from the official record. Ishii himself, once called the Devil of Pingfong, lived quietly after the war, dying in comfort decades later. His victims had no graves, no names, no justice. It was one of the darkest moral compromises in American history, trading human suffering for military knowledge. The Soviets, outraged, conducted their own war crimes trials, exposing some of the horrors publicly. But in the West, silence reigned. The truth was buried deeper than the bodies in Manchuria. Even today, the immunity deal remains one of the most haunting chapters of the post-war era. It wasn't just about what the U.S. gained, but what it lost. In shielding Ishii, it abandoned the very principles it claimed to defend. Justice was sacrificed for data. And in doing so, it set a precedent that some crimes could be forgiven if they were useful enough. The story of Unit 731 is not just about Japan's cruelty or America's pragmatism. It's about how nations, in pursuit of power, can lose sight of humanity. It's about how the boundaries of morality collapse when war becomes science and life becomes numbers. And most of all, it's about the silence that follows, the kind that history struggles to break, even decades later.
When the guns of war fell silent in 1945, the world believed that justice would follow. The Nuremberg trials in Europe had already revealed humanity's capacity for cruelty, and the Allies promised that no war criminal would escape judgment. But in the Far East, a different story was being written, one that would remain hidden behind locked doors and sealed files for generations. While the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki still smoldered, a quiet negotiation began between the victors and the vanquished, and at its center stood the unholy legacy of Unit 731. In Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of Allied powers, oversaw Japan's reconstruction. His mission was clear: stabilize the nation, prevent Soviet influence, and transform a defeated empire into a democratic ally. But beneath the politics and diplomacy, whispers reached American intelligence. Whispers of something monstrous in Manchuria. They spoke of a secret biological warfare unit, of plague bombs, of vivisections. At first, the reports were dismissed as rumors, perhaps Soviet propaganda. But when more witnesses emerged, including Japanese officers themselves, the impossible began to sound plausible. The U.S. Biological Warfare Division sent investigators to Japan. Their task was to determine whether these experiments had taken place, and if so, what knowledge could be extracted. The initial findings horrified even the scientists accustomed to wartime research. Reports described dissection without anesthesia, live vivisection, frostbite trials, deliberate infection of civilians, and entire villages wiped out for testing. It was worse than what the Nazis had done, and that comparison was not made lightly. But instead of preparing indictments, American officials began calculating value. They reasoned that Japan's data, gathered through the deaths of thousands, might save millions if used to protect U.S. soldiers in future conflicts. At Fort Detrick, in Maryland, the heart of America's biological weapons program, researchers waited eagerly for what they called the Manchurian material. It was data no Western scientist could ethically obtain, and that was precisely what made it so tempting. In 1946, U.S. intelligence officers began meeting secretly with former members of Unit 731. Some were scientists, others were officers. All were war criminals by international law. Yet instead of interrogation, they faced interviews and offers. The Americans wanted details: how experiments were performed, what diseases were weaponized, what delivery systems worked best. The Japanese scientists, realizing their lives hung in the balance, cooperated eagerly. They handed over files, sketches, even preserved samples. In return, they asked for one thing: immunity. Shiro Ishii, ever the strategist, negotiated his own salvation. He promised that his research would give the United States an edge over any enemy, especially the Soviets, who were conducting their own biological programs. Ishii convinced U.S. officials that Japan's data could not be replicated without massive loss of life and time. His argument worked. The Americans, desperate to outpace Moscow, agreed. Ishii's name was removed from the list of war criminals. He was never tried. His subordinates were shielded, and the information gathered through human suffering was quietly shipped to American laboratories. While Ishii enjoyed his freedom, other war criminals faced the gallows in Tokyo. The irony was staggering. Men who commanded armies died for their crimes, while those who dissected children in the name of science walked free. The Tokyo trials mentioned biological warfare only briefly, and even then, the topic was carefully redirected. The American prosecution team was instructed to avoid the subject entirely. What was once considered a monstrous crime became a classified asset. Meanwhile, in the Soviet-occupied zone of Asia, the story was very different. The Red Army captured several Unit 731 personnel during their invasion of Manchuria. The Soviets conducted their own trials in Khabarovsk in 1949, where confessions detailed the full extent of Japan's biological atrocities. Unlike the U.S., the Soviets made their findings public, though the Western world dismissed the proceedings as propaganda. It would take decades for historians to realize that the Soviets were telling the truth. The immunity deal created a silence that lasted for generations. In Japan, the subject of Unit 731 became taboo. Survivors were ignored, witnesses silenced, and textbooks censored. The Japanese government denied the existence of the program for years, calling it a fabrication. Ishii's men reintegrated into society with shocking ease. Many of them took prestigious positions in universities, hospitals, and pharmaceutical companies. Some even became leaders in Japan's post-war medical industry. Men who had once killed in laboratories now healed in clinics, their pasts erased. One of Ishii's former subordinates, Dr. Masaji Kitano, became the president of the Green Cross Corporation, one of Japan's leading pharmaceutical firms. Others joined the National Institute of Health. None faced trial. None expressed remorse. They lived out their lives under new identities or respected titles, while their victims were buried nameless in foreign soil. The U.S. government, for its part, classified all documents related to the Unit 731 immunity agreement. For decades, the files were locked away, labeled top secret. When families of victims in China and Korea demanded justice, their cries went unanswered. When journalists asked questions, they were met with silence. America, the nation that had led the moral crusade against Nazi atrocities, had become complicit in the cover-up of equally horrific crimes. Behind closed doors, the data from Manchuria was studied and integrated into U.S. biological defense research. Reports circulated within Fort Detrick detailing plague vectors, anthrax dispersal methods, and human reaction to extreme conditions. The information was considered scientifically significant. Military officials argued that while the methods used to obtain it were regrettable, the results could not be ignored. It was a justification born of fear of falling behind in a new kind of warfare. But morality cannot be buried forever. In the 1980s, Japanese journalists and historians began uncovering evidence that the government had long denied. Former soldiers broke their silence, confessing their roles in the atrocities. Villagers in China pointed to ruins and mass graves as proof of what had happened. Slowly, the truth surfaced. Yet even as it did, official recognition lagged behind. Japan's government maintained cautious language, calling the events regrettable but avoiding full acknowledgement of the program. In 1989, the remains of Unit 731 victims were accidentally unearthed during construction in Tokyo's Shinjuku district. Bones showed signs of surgical incisions. Locals demanded an investigation. For a moment, the silence cracked, but only slightly. The Japanese Ministry of Health admitted that the remains likely belonged to human experimentation subjects, but still avoided direct reference to Unit 731. The story faded again, buried under the weight of politics and national pride. Meanwhile, in the United States, declassified documents began to reveal the truth. In the 1990s, journalists uncovered evidence of the immunity deal. Memos and letters between American military officials explicitly discussed protecting Ishii and his team in exchange for data. The revelation caused outrage, but by then, all the key figures were long dead. There would be no trials, no justice, only history's cold record. The survivors' families continued to fight for acknowledgement. Chinese victims' descendants filed lawsuits against the Japanese government. Few succeeded. Courts ruled that individual compensation was impossible because of post-war treaties. Apologies were offered, but always in vague diplomatic terms. The human cost of Unit 731 was reduced to a line in textbooks, if mentioned at all. Yet the moral questions lingered. Could the data gained through such evil ever truly be justified? Could knowledge purchased with human lives be called progress? For every scientist who defended the immunity deal, there were others who saw it as a betrayal of civilization itself. They argued that science without ethics is merely cruelty in disguise, and that by shielding Ishii, America had sent a message that some crimes could be forgiven so long as they were useful. Today, historians estimate that over 10,000 people died directly within Unit 731 facilities, and tens of thousands more from field experiments and biological attacks. Many of the victims were children, women, and prisoners who never held weapons. They died not in battle, but in laboratories, anonymous casualties of a war most of the world never saw. And while their killers found comfort in freedom, the truth continues to haunt both Japan and the United States. The immunity deal stands as one of the most chilling examples of how morality bends under the weight of geopolitics. It reminds us that history is not written by the righteous, but by the powerful.
For decades after the war, Unit 731 vanished into the shadows of history, erased from Japan's collective memory and hidden behind layers of U.S. secrecy. The silence was so absolute that an entire generation grew up never hearing the name Unit 731. It was as if the atrocities had never happened. But silence, like pressure, builds over time, and every buried truth eventually claws its way to the surface. It began with whispers, from former soldiers who could no longer carry the weight of their memories. They were old men by the 1970s, haunted by nightmares of screams in cold laboratories, of children pleading, of frostbitten flesh snapping like glass. They spoke to journalists, sometimes anonymously, sometimes with trembling hands. They said, "We were told it was for the emperor. We were told it was for science, but we knew it was murder." These confessions ignited a spark.
Investigative reporters began searching for survivors, witnesses, and documents. In China, the city of Harbin still carried the scars of the occupation. Locals remembered the strange black smoke that rose from the Pinfang compound, the sudden outbreaks of plague that wiped out entire villages, and the Japanese soldiers who would arrive afterward wearing masks. They knew something evil had happened there. Archaeologists started digging near the ruins of the Unit 731 complex. What they found confirmed the worst fears. Bones, surgical tools, glass containers still labeled with disease names. Even children's remains cut open and marked for experimentation. The ghosts of Manchuria were finally speaking. In Japan, however, official denial persisted. The government avoided the topic, calling the evidence unverified. Textbooks omitted any mention of human experimentation. The post-war generation was taught that Japan's greatest sin had been losing the war, not what it had done during it. This selective memory was no accident. It was policy. Many of the scientists from Unit 731 had become pillars of Japan's post-war scientific community. They built new institutions, founded companies, and trained young doctors. Their success made it uncomfortable to revisit their past. To admit their crimes would mean unraveling a portion of Japan's national reconstruction, a reconstruction built in part on the knowledge they had stolen from the dead. Dr. Masaji Kitano, Ishii's right-hand man, became a respected medical researcher. Others joined the Ministry of Health or worked in universities developing vaccines and drugs. Their wartime experiences gave them expertise that few could match, and Japan's rapid modernization created a demand for exactly that kind of knowledge. No one wanted to ask where it came from. Meanwhile, in the United States, the files remained sealed. The scientists at Fort Detrick quietly used the data in classified research. They studied human tolerance to diseases, frostbite, and dehydration, information derived from the deaths of civilians and POWs. Internally, some scientists questioned the morality of using such data, but military officials insisted it was necessary for national security. The Cold War had begun, and ethics were a luxury. For years, anyone who tried to expose the truth was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. Western historians considered the Soviet Khabarovsk trials propaganda. The few documents that leaked seemed too horrific to believe. But then, in 1981, a book changed everything. Journalist Seiichi Morimura published The Devil's Gluttony, a detailed investigation into Unit 731 based on survivor accounts and hidden testimony. The book caused a national scandal. For the first time, ordinary Japanese citizens learned what their country had done in Manchuria. The descriptions of live dissection, plague bombs, and deliberate infection of prisoners shocked the nation. The backlash was immediate. Conservative politicians called it unpatriotic fiction. Veterans groups protested. But the public reaction was different. Thousands of readers demanded an inquiry. The government responded by promising to study the issue. But the truth was that no one wanted to touch the sleeping monster. Still, the dam had cracked. Survivors began coming forward. Chinese and Korean victims or their families filed lawsuits against the Japanese government, demanding recognition and compensation. But Japan's courts rejected most of them, citing international treaties that waived individual claims after the war. Justice, it seemed, was still secondary to diplomacy. Even so, each testimony was another blow to the wall of denial. Survivors described being captured by Japanese troops, taken to epidemic prevention stations, and subjected to experiments disguised as medical treatment. They spoke of injections that made their skin rot, of surgeries without anesthesia, of dying children left as control subjects. The details were too specific, too consistent to dismiss. At the same time, American historians began uncovering declassified military records. One memo from 1947, written by U.S. intelligence officers, explicitly stated that immunity would be granted to Unit 731 personnel in exchange for full disclosure. The justification was chilling. The data, they said, had great value to the U.S. Another report praised the unique and previously unobtainable nature of the experiments. In other words, it was information only possible through crimes against humanity. This revelation shattered the moral narrative of post-war justice. How could the United States, the nation that condemned Nazi doctors at Nuremberg, secretly protect Japanese war criminals for the same crimes? The contradiction was staggering, yet the logic behind it was simple. Power, not principle, guided decisions in the aftermath of war. General MacArthur himself approved the immunity deal. The US wanted Japan as a bulwark against communism, not a source of further instability. Prosecuting Ishii would have reopened wounds and risked Soviet influence, so the crimes were buried. In exchange, the US gained a scientific advantage, cold calculus in the name of strategy. When this information became public decades later, many Americans were horrified. Historians compared it to Operation Paperclip, the US program that brought Nazi scientists to America after the war. But there was one crucial difference. Most of the Unit 731 victims were never even identified, and their deaths were erased from history. There were no monuments, no names, no graves, only numbers in lab notebooks. By the early 1990s, pressure for acknowledgement grew. Activists demanded that Japan's government issue a formal apology. The evidence was undeniable. Photographs, testimonies, and declassified files all pointed to the same conclusion. Yet the official response remained cautious. Japan expressed deep regret for wartime suffering, but avoided explicit mention of Unit 731. Politicians feared diplomatic fallout, especially with China. In 1995, a rare moment of reckoning occurred. The Japanese Prime Minister, Tomiichi Murayama, issued a statement expressing deep remorse and heartfelt apology for the suffering caused by Japan's aggression. It was the most direct acknowledgement yet, but even then, Unit 731 was not named. For many, it felt like an apology to the world, but not to the victims. In China, museums dedicated to the memory of Unit 731's victims were established. The Harbin Museum, built on the original site of the compound, displayed surgical tables, preserved artifacts, and the haunting photographs taken by Japanese personnel during the war. Visitors could see the steel doors, the gas chambers, the cages where prisoners once waited for death. For survivors, it was both a wound and a memorial, proof that their suffering was real. Yet even as the truth emerged, denial persisted in some corners of Japan. Textbook debates erupted over how to describe wartime actions. Some nationalist politicians argued that stories about Unit 731 were exaggerated or politically motivated. Others called for removing them entirely from school curricula. The fight for memory had become a fight for identity. Meanwhile, in the US, historians continued digging through declassified archives. They discovered not only proof of the immunity deal, but also correspondence suggesting that American scientists had replicated some of the research. Experiments on disease resistance, frostbite, and plague dispersal were conducted under controlled conditions, but using knowledge gained from Ishii's crimes. The moral contamination ran deep. As the new millennium approached, the victims' families sought one last measure of justice, not revenge, but recognition. They wanted the world to remember. In 2002, a Tokyo court finally acknowledged Japan's role in the atrocities of Unit 731, stating that the Imperial Army had conducted biological warfare and human experimentation. However, the court also ruled that individual compensation was impossible under existing treaties. The victims won the truth, but not restitution. That judgment symbolized everything about Unit 731's legacy: truth without justice, acknowledgement without accountability. The world now knew, but no one would pay. Even today, the shadow of Unit 731 lingers in the moral landscape of modern warfare. The question remains: can knowledge built on suffering ever be ethically used? Some scientists argue that data derived from atrocities must be destroyed, that it is tainted forever. Others insist that to ignore it would dishonor the victims, that its use, however painful, might save lives. The debate continues, unresolved. What cannot be debated is this: the immunity granted to Japan's bioweapon scientists set a dangerous precedent. It told the world that even the worst crimes could be forgiven if they were useful enough, that science could excuse savagery, that justice could be negotiated. And perhaps, most chilling of all, it showed that even in victory, morality can lose.
For decades, Unit 731 was a ghost story whispered in the corners of history. A truth too heavy for nations to face, too dark for textbooks, too useful for superpowers to condemn. But time, as it always does, kept moving forward. The men who once worked in the cold rooms of Pingfong grew old. The children of their victims grew up, and slowly, piece by piece, the silence began to crack. In the late 1990s, a group of Japanese teachers launched a project to uncover the forgotten chapters of their own nation's past. They traveled to Harbin, to the site of Unit 731, and stood before the ruins. Brick walls blackened by fire, iron restraints rusted by time. What they saw there broke them. One teacher said, "We teach our children to be honest, yet our country has hidden this truth for half a century." They returned home and began teaching about Unit 731 in their classrooms, despite backlash from parents and officials who said it shamed Japan. Their courage reignited public debate. Documentaries, books, and survivor interviews began surfacing, each more disturbing than the last. Chinese witnesses recounted the screams they heard echoing from the compound. Former guards described burning bodies, flushing blood down drains, and watching prisoners convulse from infections. One soldier confessed, "I could not look into their eyes. I thought they were no longer human. That was the only way I could continue." And through all this, one question remained. How could the world, the victors of World War II, have allowed this to stay hidden? The answer lies not in morality, but in geopolitics. When the Cold War began, the United States saw the Soviet Union not as an ally, but as an existential threat. And in that new war, knowledge became the most powerful weapon. The American military understood that the data from Unit 731 could give them an edge, not only in biological warfare, but in defense against it. Diseases, frostbite endurance, plague transmission. It was grotesque, but it was information no one else had. So the decision was made, quietly, efficiently, immunity in exchange for data. The Japanese doctors who dissected living prisoners would never see the inside of a courtroom. Their findings would be classified, analyzed, and integrated into U.S. research programs. General MacArthur himself approved the arrangement, citing strategic value, history's moral compass bent under the weight of strategy. What makes this story even more haunting is that the Soviet Union conducted its own trials in 1949, the Khabarovsk trials, where captured Japanese officers testified to the atrocities. They spoke of how diseases were tested on civilians, how plague-infected fleas were dropped on Chinese villages, and how the Japanese military planned to unleash biological warfare against the Allies. But in the West, these trials were dismissed as communist propaganda. The world turned away, convinced that only the Nazis had performed such horrors. In this silence, the survivors of Unit 731's crimes were forgotten. For decades, families in China, Korea, and Mongolia mourned their loss without answers. They buried empty coffins. They told their children stories of fathers who disappeared in the war. For them, justice was not denied. It was erased. Then, something extraordinary happened. In 2018, Japan's National Archives unexpectedly released the names of over 3,000 members of Unit 731. It was the first official acknowledgement in history that the unit existed as a biological warfare force. The document listed names, ranks, and assignments, proof that could no longer be ignored. For historians and survivors alike, it was vindication, but it came too late. Every name on that list belonged to someone who had already lived their life without consequence. The revelation reopened old wounds. Survivors groups in China and South Korea renewed calls for apologies and compensation. But still, the Japanese government refused to accept legal responsibility, insisting that all wartime issues had been settled by previous treaties. For the victims, this was salt on centuries-old wounds. For the world, it was a reminder that history's justice often comes without punishment. The story of Unit 731 is not just about war crimes. It is about the dangerous marriage between science and power. The men who committed these atrocities were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were doctors, researchers, men of education and discipline. Many had families. They saw themselves as pioneers, not killers. They believed they were serving their nation, advancing human knowledge. But in their quest for discovery, they stripped their subjects of humanity, and in doing so, lost their own. The lesson here is timeless. Science without ethics becomes weaponry. Curiosity without conscience becomes cruelty. As technology advances, we must ask ourselves, how far are we willing to go in the name of progress? Unit 731 reminds us that data can be both powerful and poisonous, a gift wrapped in tragedy. The information they gather through torture has undoubtedly saved lives since then, informing modern medicine and defense. But at what cost? Can knowledge ever be clean if it was born in blood? Even today, governments struggle with these moral boundaries. Experiments in bioengineering, artificial intelligence, and genetic manipulation all raise echoes of Unit 731 because every generation faces the same question. Where do we draw the line? The United States' decision to protect Ishihi scientists was not just an act of wartime pragmatism. It was a signal that morality can be suspended if the reward is great enough. That precedent shaped the world that followed. A world where intelligence agencies performed secret experiments on unwitting citizens, where soldiers were tested with radiation exposure, where the pursuit of control outweighed the value of life. And yet, amidst this darkness, there were small acts of resistance. Some Japanese nurses refused to participate in the dissections. A few soldiers sabotaged experiments, freeing captives when they could. Others spent their later years confessing, trying to cleanse their souls. One nurse in her final interview whispered, "I still hear them, the patients. They call my name." These are the voices history tried to bury. As we look back, we must also look inward, because the true horror of Unit 731 is not that it happened, but that it was allowed to. The doctors who performed those experiments were not monsters. They were shaped by ideology, by obedience, by the belief that their nation's survival justified any act. That same logic exists in every war, in every age. When people are taught to obey without question, when science serves politics instead of truth, when a flag becomes more sacred than a human life, Unit 731 is reborn. So we tell this story not to condemn a country, but to confront the human capacity for both brilliance and brutality. To remember that the line between healer and killer, between discovery and destruction, is thinner than we like to believe. In Harbin today, the museum at the site of Unit 731 stands as both a warning and a memorial. Visitors walk through cold corridors lined with glass cases, vials of preserved organs, surgical tools, photographs of experiments. The air feels heavy, as if the building itself remembers. School children come here to learn not just about war, but about what happens when humanity surrenders to ideology. On the walls are words written in multiple languages. May this never happen again. But history has a way of repeating itself when forgotten. That is why the story must be told again and again, in every classroom, every documentary, every conversation, because the victims of Unit 731 cannot speak, but their silence teaches us everything we need to know about the cost of blind obedience. As the camera fades, imagine the ruins of Pingfong at dusk. The winds move through the broken windows. The shadows of rusted operating tables stretch long across the floor. Somewhere in the darkness, the echo of a child's voice drifts, a whisper lost to time. And you, the listener, are left to decide what kind of world we build from their ashes. Never again must knowledge be purchased with pain. Never again should a nation's power outweigh its humanity. Because in the end, every empire falls, every secret surfaces, and every silence, no matter how deep, eventually breaks.